The siege of Jerusalem represented a significant military operation, unprecedented since the fall of Carthage 2 centuries prior. Commencing in April 70 AD and enduring for nearly 5 months, this conflict was marked by intense and relentless fighting for control over every part of the city. The outcome was crucial, not only for the Great Revolt in Judea, but also for the survival of the Jewish people. Roman involvement in Judea began in 63 BC, when Pompey the Great intervened in a civil war and subsequently captured Jerusalem. The region experienced considerable turmoil during the latter years of the Republic, including a takeover by the Parthians, before Roman legions returned to establish the puppet king Herod. Over time, a succession of procurators governed Judea, many of whom lacked the necessary competence and military strength to maintain order. Roman authority heavily relied on local elites, who often struggled to gain the trust and respect of the Jewish populace. Additionally, Judea's population was fragmented along class, ethnic, and religious lines, contributing to the region's instability and the constant threat of revolution. In May 66 AD, civil unrest erupted, exacerbated by the heavy-handed response of the Roman procurator Florus, who further inflamed tensions by plundering parts of southwest Jerusalem, resulting in the deaths of 3,600 individuals. As the situation deteriorated, reinforcements arrived from Caesarea, but were quickly repelled by a widespread rebellion. Jewish rebels seized control of Jerusalem, while Roman strongholds in Judea and Perea were limited. The Roman response to the uprising was spearheaded by Vespasian and his son Titus under the orders of Emperor Nero. The campaign of 67 AD began with an advance from Antioch, focusing on subduing Galilee. Given the Romans' significant military advantage, field battles were rare, and most confrontations occurred around fortified positions. This led to particularly harsh treatment of populations that did not surrender promptly, as Rome sought to make a strong statement. For example, during the 68th AD offensive in Judea, cities downstream learned of the Roman army's approach not through messengers, but by the sight of bodies floating down the Jordan River. The campaign ultimately stalled with the news of Nero's death. The period of turmoil that ensued is referred to as the Year of 4 Emperors, during which Vespasian made his move for power on July 1st, 69 AD. By the summer of 70 AD, he emerged victorious and set sail for Rome to claim his title. In the meantime, Titus was tasked with leading the campaign in Judea, with the objective of quelling the Jewish uprising. This necessitated the long-awaited assault on Jerusalem, the stronghold of the rebel leaders, and the epicenter of resistance. Titus initiated the Jerusalem campaign in the spring of 70 AD, assembling an army of 4 legions in Alexandria before marching north to Caesarea along the coast. His forces were bolstered by 23 cohorts of auxiliary infantry, 8 cavalry units, and various detachments of local troops provided by regional client rulers. Historical estimates suggest that this combined force numbered around 60,000 men, with core legionary troops constituting approximately 35% of the army, auxiliary troops about 32%, and local forces around 33%. While the high proportion of local troops raises questions about the accuracy of these figures, it is reasonable to assume that local rulers were eager to contribute to the war effort in hopes of securing Rome's favor during a tumultuous revolt. Roman commanders likely welcomed the additional manpower. Although local forces may not have been as dependable as the elite legionaries, they could manage various responsibilities, allowing the seasoned troops to focus on their strengths. This would be particularly crucial in the impending siege of a city as large and well fortified as Jerusalem. As the Roman forces approached Jerusalem, they marched in separate columns due to the logistical challenges posed by the Judean hill country. Titus led the 12th and 15th legions along the most direct route, while the 5th Macedonica advanced via Emmaus and the 10th Fretenses approached from Jericho. On April 23rd, the leading units of the 12th and 15th Legions reached the hills north of the city. That evening, the 5th Macedonica arrived, and by morning the remainder of the army was on the battlefield, facing the magnificent city adorned with gleaming temples and formidable fortifications. The city of Jerusalem is encircled on three sides by steep ravines: the Kidron Valley to the east, the Gihon Valley to the west, and the Hinnom Valley sweeping around the south. The region is further characterized by a series of hills, including the renowned Mount of Olives to the east. Ancient Jerusalem was constructed atop several significant topographical features, incorporating two land spurs separated by the Tyropoeon Valley. The Temple Mount and the Antonia Fortress were situated on the eastern spur, while the western spur was occupied by the elite, who developed the upper city during the Hasmonean and Herodian periods. In contrast, the more ancient and densely populated lower city lay between these two areas. Both the upper and lower cities were enclosed by a wall, reinforced by substantial fortifications surrounding the Temple Mount. As the population expanded beyond these confines, a second city emerged to the north of the original wall. This newly exposed area was subsequently encircled by a second wall, extending from the Antonia in the east to the Geneth Gate in the west. By the 1st century AD, a further suburb, known as the New City, had developed to the north. This expansion necessitated additional fortifications, leading Herod Agrippa to commission the construction of a third wall in 41 AD. This ambitious undertaking involved massive stone blocks intended to enclose a substantial area. However, the scale of these defensive works raised suspicions among the Romans, prompting them to compel their client king to abandon the project before its completion. During the Jewish Revolt, the inhabitants of Jerusalem managed to finalize their third layer of fortifications. By the time the Roman legions approached, the walls had been elevated by an additional 9 meters, and a series of square towers had been constructed, projecting outward. The combination of challenging terrain and robust walls created a formidable, three-tiered defensive network. Furthermore, the intricate maze of narrow streets between the fortifications could easily be blockaded, while numerous underground water and sewage passages allowed defenders to launch surprise attacks from various directions. Within this extensively fortified city resided a garrison of approximately 20,000 Jewish troops. However, these forces were not professional soldiers. Rather, they comprised a diverse mix of militiamen, refugees, and zealots. This composition reflects the deeply fragmented nature of the Jewish resistance. Since the onset of the revolt, an effective centralized government had failed to materialize, resulting in a chronic inability to unify the various factions. Jerusalem was divided along political lines and embroiled in violent infighting until the arrival of the Roman forces. The primary leaders during this period were Simon Gioras, who controlled the upper city, and John of Gischala, who operated from the Temple Mount. Simon commanded the larger contingent, consisting of 10,000 troops, organized under 50 officers, along with 6,000 allied Idumeans, led by 8 commanders. These forces were stationed along the first wall, extending from the Kidron Valley to the Palace of the Kings. Conversely, John commanded an armed group of approximately 6,000 men, supported by 20 officers, and was allied with Eleazar, who brought an additional 2,400 zealots. Together, they maintained control over the Temple Mount and its adjacent neighborhoods, including the Ophel and the Tyropoeon Valley. The traditional Jewish fighters were generally lightly armed and armored, employing ranged weapons such as slings, bows, and javelins, before engaging in close combat with spears, swords, and clubs. Although they exhibited agility and determination, they often faced significant challenges in direct confrontations with Roman forces, particularly against heavy cavalry. Nevertheless, the Jewish defenders in Jerusalem were notably better equipped than usual having accumulated arms and armor from various sources, including Jewish workshops, Herodian armories, arms dealers, defectors, and vanquished foes. A considerable quantity of equipment was also procured from the defeated Romans at Beth Haran, which included a variety of artillery pieces. Furthermore, the chaotic nature of siege warfare diminished many of the advantages typically held by Roman forces in open-field battles. It is also important to note that the defenders' morale was bolstered by the instinct for survival that often emerges when a city is determined to either resist or perish. While analyzing military forces is crucial, it is equally important to recognize that sieges are fundamentally battles of attrition. Consequently, one must consider the availability of food and water supplies. Fortunately, fresh water was not an immediate concern due to the presence of numerous cisterns throughout the city, as well as several large reservoirs for rainwater collection. However, food supplies were a pressing issue, as many grain stores had been looted or destroyed during the internal conflicts that preceded the siege. Furthermore, the already substantial population of Jerusalem had escalated to precarious levels in recent weeks due to the influx of pilgrims commemorating Passover. The civilian population significantly outnumbered the armed defenders, which imposed considerable constraints on the duration of available supplies. As the Roman forces encircled Jerusalem, the countdown to conflict commenced. The Roman army had undertaken a lengthy march to reach the city, and General Titus acknowledged the fatigue of his troops, subsequently ordering the establishment of preliminary camps situated beyond the range of the city's defenses. The 12th and 15th legions, having arrived from the northeast, began to set up camp approximately 1 kilometer away on Mount Scopus, with an additional encampment planned for the 5th Macedonica, situated 550 meters further back. As the legions positioned themselves, Titus advanced ahead to personally assess the defensive structures. On the morning of April 23rd, he departed with a contingent of 600 cavalrymen, following the route to the main entrance of the third wall. However, the uneven terrain was obstructed by gardens, olive groves, hedges, fences, walls, and stone ruins left by the defenders, creating a complex array of obstacles. Suddenly, Jewish forces emerged from the gate and overwhelmed the Roman column, effectively splitting it in two. The cavalrymen at the rear fled into the open countryside from which they had come, while Titus and his escorts found themselves isolated. The general, having neglected to don his helmet or breastplate for this reconnaissance, nonetheless drew his sword and initiated a charge to break free. According to the historian Josephus, he diverted those who came at him with his sword, overturned many of those who directly confronted him, and made his horse ride over those that were overthrown. This encounter was perilous, yet the Romans ultimately managed to carve a path through, albeit at the cost of several lives and numerous injuries. It is likely that Titus was unsettled by this incident and eager to commence the siege. He ordered the 10th Fretenses to advance closer and initiated the construction of entrenchments on the Mount of Olives. In response to their near success, the Jewish forces were emboldened and launched a significant counter-offensive, with sorties emerging from the eastern and southern gates, targeting the engaged legionaries. Combatants surged across the Kidron Valley, launching an assault on the incompletely constructed encampment of the 10th Fretenses. The Roman forces were taken completely by surprise. Jewish troops commenced an offensive, systematically eliminating their disorganized adversaries, while additional reinforcements emerged from the city to consolidate their advantage. Titus, accompanied by his bodyguard, executed a flank attack that successfully repelled the advancing mob back into the ravine. The 10th Fretenses resumed their construction efforts, only to face another onslaught from the Jewish forces, which had been steadily augmenting their numbers. This intense assault overwhelmed the Roman contingent positioned in the low ground, prompting many soldiers to retreat to higher ground, while Titus and a select group of troops endeavored to maintain their defensive line. Shortly thereafter, the legionaries regrouped and launched a counteroffensive, driving the Jewish forces back once again. During the ensuing respite, the fortifications of the camp were finally completed, securing the Roman forward position, but highlighting the critical misjudgment regarding the strength of the Jewish defense. In light of this, Titus implemented measures to guard against further counterattacks. He stationed cavalry units to intercept potential assaults and mandated the clearance of all obstacles between the Roman encampments and the city walls. This involved the removal of trees, leveling hedges, filling ditches, and demolishing rock outcroppings. The Roman army was now fully committed to the task at hand. Acknowledging the challenges posed by the steep ravines to the east, Titus resolved to concentrate his efforts on the western flank of the third wall. The 10th Fretensis was assigned to secure the Mount of Olos, while the remaining 3 legions were redeployed. The 5th Macedonica established a camp 400 meters west of the western gate, while the 12th and 15th legions positioned themselves opposite the Sophinus Tower. Artillery units were strategically deployed, their sights trained on the city. Under the protective cover of artillery fire, each legion commenced the construction of an earthen and timber ramp leading up to the third wall. Despite the relentless barrage of Jewish projectiles and the persistent interference of attack parties at all hours, the combined strength of the 3 legions, bolstered by artillery support, proved insurmountable. The attackers successfully completed their ramps and began to maneuver battering rams into position. The resounding impact of the rams signified progress for the Romans, while simultaneously serving as a rallying point for the defenders. Militia units from across the city rapidly assembled to bombard the Roman crews and their guards with projectiles from above, while raiding parties launched assaults on the siege engines from ground level. The valiant defenders advanced to the protective sheds along the ramp, preparing to dismantle the equipment, but they were repelled by a cavalry charge led by Titus. Before resuming the ramming, Roman engineers constructed 3 siege towers that were too heavy to be toppled and were fireproofed. These towers were strategically positioned to provide close fire support for construction efforts and to eliminate the defenders from the area. On the 15th day of the siege, the rams successfully breached the third wall, prompting the Jewish forces to surrender the outer city to the Romans and retreat to the second wall. Eager to maintain momentum, Titus established a camp in the heart of the newly acquired city, where numerous structures were built. The rams were repositioned to target the central tower gate, and within 4 days, a breach was created. As the legionaries organized and advanced through the narrow opening, they encountered an unsettling silence. Cautiously navigating the seemingly abandoned streets, they were suddenly ambushed from all sides. The trap had been set, and the Jewish defenders commenced a barrage of missiles directed at the densely packed Roman infantry. Concurrently, hit-and-run units targeted any Roman soldiers who had strayed too far from their main contingent. In a state of shock, the Romans attempted to retreat through the breach, only to find it so constricted that only a few could pass at a time. This choke point became a prime target for the defenders' archers and slingers. Roman archer units were deployed to provide covering fire, alleviating some pressure and facilitating a withdrawal. However, the Jewish forces seized the opportunity to advance as the Roman troops fell back, rushing to the walls and launching continuous assaults on the attackers. Simultaneously, sorties of large groups of Jewish fighters pressed the Romans back while the breach was repaired. Josephus recounts that the fighting persisted throughout the day and into the night, with skirmishes around the tower gate continuing unabated. By the 4th day, the legions managed to breach the defenses once more. This time, Titus ordered the complete demolition of the northern section of the second wall, with Roman forces occupying the surrounding towers. The Jewish defenders then retreated to the first wall as part of a calculated strategy to conduct a fighting withdrawal, conserving their strength while inflicting maximum damage on the Romans. The commanders were now positioned to make a stand, as the defensive line had been significantly reduced in size compared to the beginning of the siege. The numerical disadvantage faced by the Jewish forces enabled them to effectively concentrate their efforts and repel assaults. At this juncture, Simon had been appointed the overall commander of the defense, overseeing the first wall along the northern perimeter, which extended to the royal palace. The Temple Mount and the Antonia fortress on the eastern flank were held by the Johns, Galileans, and Zealots. Meanwhile, the Roman legions advanced into the city, with Ted dispatching the 10th and 15th legions to construct ramps to the west, where the 2nd and 1st walls converged. To the east, the 5th and 12th legions commenced construction against the Antonia fortress, enduring continuous sorties and missile attacks. Historical accounts indicate that the Jewish forces were capable of deploying 300 bolt throwers and 40 stone throwers from their armory, a significant arsenal that likely compelled the Romans to develop their defensive measures. On May 29th, following 17 days of arduous labor and relentless harassment, the Romans completed their assault pathways on both the eastern and western flanks. They mobilized battering rams, siege towers, and numerous cohorts in preparation for a full-scale assault. However, unbeknownst to the Romans, the Jewish forces had been diligently conducting sapping operations, tunneling beneath the first wall directly toward the siege ramps, targeting the Antonia. These excavations were supported by pit props, which the Jewish defenders ignited. As the fire spread, the ground collapsed, creating a substantial chasm that engulfed the ramps and their siege engines. Although the fires were temporarily subdued, they reignited as the bitumen burned, consuming the remnants of the equipment. The Romans had once again gravely underestimated the defenders, facing dire repercussions as a result. To the west, Simon launched a nighttime sortie to assault the siege works in his sector. The courageous rebels successfully repelled the resistance and advanced toward the rams, igniting their protective sheds. The flames alarmed the legionaries, who witnessed their efforts being consumed by fire and rushed to salvage the rams. They were met by a surge of Jewish reinforcements emerging from the postern gates, resulting in a fierce confrontation. A lethal struggle ensued over the siege engines, culminating in the rebels successfully dismantling them. The demoralized Roman forces retreated, prompting the Jewish troops to seize the opportunity and pursue them, driving the legions back to their encampment. The retreat was stabilized when Titus intervened with his cavalry. Intense combat followed, but the rebels were eventually forced back to the first wall. The Roman siege lines were left in disarray, with nearly all their siege engines and ramps reduced to smoldering ruins by dawn, mirroring a decline in the morale of the legions. As the hottest part of the year approached, water supplies dwindled, and the availability of building materials became increasingly scarce. Nevertheless, Titus devised an ambitious strategy aimed at restoring the morale and security of his troops. His plan involved the construction of an 8-kilometer circumvallation wall, complete with 13 forts. To motivate the troops, he capitalized on their pride by encouraging the legions and cohorts to compete for the honor of being the first to complete their designated sections of the wall, which would be relatively safe from Jewish attacks. This competitive labor allowed the legionaries to re-establish their unit cohesion. The outcome was remarkably successful. Within 3 days, the entire structure was completed. Roman morale was revitalized, while the Jewish forces faced a stark indication that the Roman war machine was not retreating. On the contrary, the situation had escalated significantly. With the completion of the circumvallation wall, the encirclement of Jerusalem was effectively tightened. Previously, citizens had been able to venture out at night to gather supplies from the surrounding countryside, but this was no longer feasible. Any rebels apprehended outside the city walls faced crucifixion as a grim demonstration of Rome's retribution. Even those who defected voluntarily were often subjected to brutal treatment by troops who suspected they might be concealing valuable items within their bodies. Inside the city, the food situation rapidly deteriorated, with defenders resorting to consuming pets and boiling hay. Disturbing reports also emerged of instances of cannibalism involving infants. In the 10th week of the siege, General Titus commanded all forces to concentrate their efforts on the Antonia fortress. The comprehensive assault began with the deployment of archers and artillery to target the walls, while 2 battering rams were positioned and soldiers equipped with crowbars targeted the foundational blocks of the towers. Despite significant efforts on the first day, the Roman forces were compelled to withdraw for the night without making any substantial progress. Unbeknownst to both factions, however, the extensive activity in the vicinity had compromised the fortress's structural integrity. The mine, which had previously caused the collapse of the Roman siege ramps, had also undermined the Antonia. Heavy rainfall, combined with the weight of the personnel and machinery in operation, ultimately led to the collapse of the northern wall of the fortress during the night. At dawn, the Romans prepared for a direct assault through the breach. However, the Jewish defenders had anticipated this move and had already constructed an additional secondary wall on the opposite side. Reluctant to forfeit the advantage gained during the night, Titus called for volunteers to confront the fortifications directly. A small group of courageous men stepped forward, likely motivated by the promise of substantial rewards. This contingent faced intense fire as they advanced toward the barricade but managed to scale the wall. Unfortunately, their numbers were insufficient, and without reinforcements, they were ultimately overwhelmed. The visible failure of this mission diminished the morale of the Roman army, resulting in a tentative stalemate. 2 days later, in the early morning, 24 enterprising Romans, including a standard-bearer from the 5th Macedonica and a trumpeter, took the initiative to launch an attack. The men stealthily ascended the ruins of the Antonia fortress and eliminated the sentries. With the barricade secured, the trumpeter sounded a signal, causing panic among the Jewish defenders, who awoke abruptly, mistakenly believing that the entire Roman army was upon them, prompting their retreat to the Temple Mount. Meanwhile, the Roman command was equally perplexed, but recognized the necessity for action. Titus, along with his officers, assembled select soldiers from various units and promptly dispatched them toward the source of the trumpet's sound. As the Jewish defenders realized that the Romans were not pursuing them in force, cooler heads prevailed, and they regrouped. Militias began to converge in the courtyard, as it became evident that the main Roman forces would soon be advancing. If the opposing forces were to establish a presence within the sanctuary, the situation would be irretrievably compromised. Both factions recognized this critical reality and engaged in a fierce struggle as they navigated the dark passages connecting the Antonia to the Temple Mount. Intense combat ensued in the confined spaces, lasting nearly 10 hours. Ultimately, the relentless determination of the Jewish forces, bolstered by continuous reinforcements, triumphed over the Romans, who were compelled to retreat. This marked the conclusion of the First Battle of the Temple. Following this, Titus commanded his troops to fortify the Antonia on his side of the battlefield, and within a week, preparations were underway to launch a renewed assault. On the night of July 17th, 7,200 legionaries, selected from the finest troops of each century, were assembled for a surprise offensive against the ruins of the Antonia. However, Jewish sentries detected the advancing forces and raised the alarm. In certain areas, the Roman troops managed to advance beyond the previous week's high water mark. Nevertheless, the chaos of the night compounded the difficulties, particularly as the rebels had donned captured Roman equipment, leading to instances where Roman legionaries inadvertently engaged their own allies. The confusion rendered it nearly impossible for either side to capitalize on any territorial gains. As dawn broke, a semblance of order was restored, and according to Josephus, both factions regrouped into disorganized battle lines along the northern edge of the sanctuary. Projectiles began to be exchanged, resulting in a brutal confrontation. Despite Titus's efforts to coordinate a systematic attack, the confined environment once again thwarted these attempts. By midday, it became evident that no significant progress could be achieved, leading to the cessation of the Second Battle of the Temple. It was clear that breaching the Jewish stronghold was unfeasible. Consequently, Titus resolved to expand the scope of the assault, directing the construction of 4 additional ramps against the northwestern corner of the Temple Mount during the peak of the summer heat. In response to the Roman advances, the Jewish defenders concentrated their missile fire on the walls and deployed continuous waves of skirmishers and sorties to disrupt the work crews. Despite these efforts, the Roman legion made consistent progress. As construction approached completion, the defenders dismantled the northwestern corner of the temple colonnade, effectively severing the connection between the defensive parapets and the remaining structures of the Antonia. This action eliminated a crucial route that the Romans intended to use for their assault. Concurrently, a significant sally was launched against the Roman circumvallation at the Mount of Olives. Although this attempt was unsuccessful, it underscored the audacity of the defenders, who, like a cornered beast, proved to be formidable. On July 27th, Roman workers at the damaged end of the western colonnade identified a potential opportunity, as Jewish activity on other fronts appeared to have led to a withdrawal of defensive forces in the vicinity. The legions swiftly advanced with ladders to execute an immediate escalade. Hundreds of troops surged onto the unguarded walls, with many more following closely behind. However, the Jewish retreat had been a calculated ruse. In the preceding days, they had covertly filled the rafters with dry wood and bitumen, which they ignited at the opportune moment. The entire section of the wall erupted in flames, ensnaring the Roman assault troops in the conflagration. This dramatic event unfolded before both armies and significantly bolstered the morale of the defenders. In light of this setback, the Romans adopted a more cautious approach, opting to breach the walls using rams and picks instead of attempting another escalade. For several days, they labored tirelessly in shifts to undermine the defensive fortifications while enduring a relentless barrage of missiles and harassment. Although they managed to dislodge several large blocks, the robust construction of the Temple Mount resisted all efforts at destruction. The frustration of Titus must have been immense. In a desperate bid for progress, he ordered another assault on the walls, which predictably resulted in heavy casualties. Roman troops attempting to scale the ladders were left vulnerable, with many being toppled in their efforts, while others who successfully reached the top found themselves isolated and exposed to continuous artillery and archer fire. The forces that managed to ascend were significantly outnumbered and met with devastating defeat. Roman centurions resorted to the tactic of hurling legionary eagles onto the walls in an effort to inspire the valiant soldiers to retrieve them. However, this desperate strategy proved ineffective, resulting in the further loss of resolute attackers. Consequently, the increasingly costly assault was ultimately abandoned. Rather than relinquish all hope, Titus initiated preparations for another offensive against the temple at the beginning of August. The objective was to breach the bottleneck at the Antonia and advance swiftly into the open spaces of the courtyard, where the legions would have the room necessary to engage effectively in combat. Archers and artillery were concentrated in and around the ruins of the Antonia, targeting defenders entrenched at the northern end of the temple complex. Once these defenders were neutralized, Roman troops proceeded to incinerate and dismantle the entire northern colonnade. This action enabled the attackers to deploy across the full width of the plaza while simultaneously eliminating a critical Jewish defensive position. Although the northern battlements were now in ruins, sightlines were opened to the other flanking defensive positions. The defenders stationed there found themselves in a precarious situation and were compelled to retreat. The Jewish line of defense was subsequently restructured, now extending across the center of the Temple Mount, with the temple itself serving as a central stronghold. During this period, a grave omen occurred, marking a spiritual crisis involving the daily sacrifice of lambs to Yahweh. The priests had diligently maintained the sacred rite of tamed amidst the bloodshed and starvation resulting from the siege. However, on the 5th of August, the last of the sacrificial lambs was exhausted. At this critical juncture of the siege, with Roman forces advancing, the Jewish defenders found themselves severed from their connection to God. The stage was now set for a confrontation over the very heart of Jerusalem, the Temple Mount. The left flank of the beleaguered Jewish line was positioned at the western gate, providing access to the upper city, while the right flank was anchored on the opposite side of the colonnade at Solomon's portico. The center of the line traversed the temple and its inner court. The Romans occupied the northern region, while the Jews controlled the southern area. Both factions were poised for a decisive confrontation within the vast gladiatorial arena of the Temple Mount complex. Central to the Jewish defenses was the inner temple, which, like the Temple Mount, was encircled by a wall featuring expansive fighting platforms atop a series of perimeter colonnades. The eastern section of the compound was designated as the Court of Women, connected to the western section by an additional wall and a Corinthian gate. Beyond this lay the court of the Israelites, followed by the court of the priests. At the far end stood the Holy of Holies, a 45-meter-tall white marble structure embellished with grand golden gates and crowned with golden points. This sacred space was regarded as the dwelling place of God, accessible only to the high priests on the Day of Atonement. Typically, access to the entire inner temple was restricted to a select few. However, extraordinary circumstances necessitated extraordinary measures, resulting in the holy areas being filled with defenders. Despite their exhaustion and near starvation, the Jewish forces launched an assault at dawn on August 9th. Troops surged from the eastern gate, advancing forcefully against the Roman lines. The Roman legions, taken by surprise, momentarily faltered but managed to maintain their positions. In response, Titus ordered his cavalry to charge across the open terrain. This small contingent of cavalry collided with the Jewish forces, creating significant disruption within their ranks. Nevertheless, the attack did not deter the rebels. The battle for the temple commenced, characterized by a chaotic series of assaults and counter-assaults along the eastern edge of the sanctuary. Jewish defenders provided supporting fire from the rooftops of the temple, while their Roman counterparts reciprocated from their rear lines. The conflict persisted for several hours before devolving into a precarious stalemate. On the following day, August 10th, the Jewish forces initiated another offensive against the Romans stationed in the outer court, marking the beginning of the fourth battle for the temple. This engagement was equally fiercely contested, but the overwhelming force of a Roman counterattack ultimately compelled the defenders back to the very walls of the temple. During the siege, Jewish defenders positioned atop the walls dislodged stones and hurled various projectiles at the Roman forces below. Amid the chaos, two legionaries acted on impulse. One seized a piece of flaming debris while the other lifted him against the northern side of the temple. From this vantage point, he cast the burning timber through a low golden door into the sanctuary chambers. The intense summer heat ignited the highly combustible wooden structures and textiles, resulting in thick, black smoke that billowed into the sky as the fire spread rapidly, astonishing both the Romans and the Jews. The conflagration quickly spiraled out of control, endangering the numerous sacred texts and treasures housed within the temple. The Jewish defenders found themselves paralyzed, torn between the decision to combat the flames or confront the advancing Romans. Seizing the opportunity, the Roman legions surged forward without explicit orders, breaching the eastern gates and infiltrating the inner court of the temple. At this critical juncture, following a grueling 3-month siege, the attackers succumbed to their baser instincts. Soldiers broke free from their commanding officers, driven solely by a toxic psychological state characterized by repressed rage and frustration. Compassion became the first casualty, swiftly followed by the brutal slaughter of those unable to escape the inferno. The young, the elderly, and the vulnerable were all mercilessly slain. This bloodlust was matched only by insatiable greed, as Roman soldiers rushed into the burning complex, intent on seizing the treasures within. The frenzy escalated to such an extent that some Roman troops were trampled by their fellow soldiers. The arrival of Titus had little impact on the chaotic state of the men, a phenomenon often observed in the final stages of a siege when even the most capable commanders struggle to rein in the fervent passions of their troops. Eventually, the frenzy subsided once the temple had been thoroughly looted by both the soldiers and the flames. As Titus was greeted with shouts of "Imperator! Imperator! Imperator!" he commanded the sacrifice of an ox, a sheep, and a pig at the eastern gate of the temple, thereby solidifying the supremacy of the Roman gods over those of the Jews. Although the Temple Mount had fallen, Jewish resistance persisted in other parts of Jerusalem, as Simon's militia and those who had escaped the burning ruins of the temple regrouped in the fortified positions of the upper city and Herod's palace. The conflict across the Tirapon Valley culminated in a parley atop a bridge that connected the opposing sides. The Jewish commanders, Simon and John, sought to negotiate safe passage out of Jerusalem. However, Titus, emboldened by his recent triumph, insisted on nothing less than an unconditional surrender. When negotiations faltered, the legions were unleashed upon the lower city as a demonstration of military might. Over the course of 2 days, they advanced through narrow alleys and on rooftops, indiscriminately targeting both rebels and non-combatants. Fires were ignited to eliminate any remaining survivors in the lower districts, resulting in extensive destruction of life and property. The flames consumed a significant number of deceased individuals in various states of decomposition, permeating the air with a foul odor. The last bastion remaining was Herod's palace, a formidable fortress characterized by robust walls and a series of towers ranging from 25 to 40 meters in height. The structures of the upper city obstructed a direct approach, while numerous underground passages provided the Jewish defenders with opportunities to conduct effective sorties against the Roman siege efforts. The Romans had previously encountered considerable difficulties with similar fortifications and were reluctant to engage in such an endeavor again. Consequently, they decided to launch their assault from the west, flanking the city from outside its walls. All 4 legions concentrated in the Hinnom Valley and commenced the construction of a final set of siege ramps. Allied and auxiliary troops within Jerusalem also began erecting their own platforms against the upper city, specifically at the viaduct, the gymnasium, and Simon's Tower. Despite the scarcity of resources and manpower, which caused some delays in construction, the projects were ultimately completed within 2.5 weeks. On September 7th, the Romans successfully positioned the remaining siege ramps and commenced their assault on the walls. At this juncture, the Jewish forces were so significantly weakened that they refrained from launching sorties against the siege equipment for the first time. The defenders attempted to resist from atop the walls, but were swiftly overwhelmed by the concentrated fire of Roman projectiles. Sections of the western wall began to deteriorate, allowing Roman legionaries to breach the defenses against a rapidly disintegrating opposing force. The realization of impending defeat seemed to envelop the battlements more swiftly than any weapon could. The prominent towers of Hippicus, Phasael, and Miriam were ultimately abandoned as survivors either succumbed to despair or sought refuge. Jewish leaders, accompanied by groups of resolute fighters, scattered in various directions, desperately attempting to navigate through the Roman lines. Many were apprehended by Roman patrols, while others resorted to crawling through sewers or trying to tunnel their way out of the city. Ultimately, both Simon and John were captured alive, along with 700 other young men who were destined to be sent to Rome for public display during the triumph of Titus. All remaining males aged 17 and above were shackled and condemned to death, either in the mines of Egypt or in gladiatorial arenas throughout the empire. Women and children were taken to the slave markets. Unfortunately, accurate figures regarding the number of lives lost or enslaved as a result of the sacking of Jerusalem remain elusive. Josephus claims that over 1.1 million were killed, while Tacitus presents a more plausible estimate of 600,000. Both figures appear to be significantly exaggerated, yet they may reflect the extensive carnage that ensued when Titus resolved to obliterate a densely populated city teeming with refugees and pilgrims. Contemporary sieges, such as that of Stalingrad, provide a grim perspective on the horrors faced by the many non-combatants trapped within the city walls. Meanwhile, in Rome, Emperor Vespasian was diligently preparing for the triumphant return of his son. The victory at Jerusalem warranted a grand triumph, which would serve as a pivotal element in legitimizing the Flavian dynasty. When the occasion arose, Titus would parade through the streets of Rome atop a chariot, leading a procession that celebrated the conquests in the east. Soldiers and captives marched in full regalia, accompanied by floats depicting dramatic scenes from the campaign, while vast treasures, including the magnificent seven-branched menorah, were prominently displayed. The pinnacle of the celebrations was marked by the execution and ritual strangulation of Simon Gioras, who had held the position of overall commander of the Jewish forces during the siege. Although the revolt may have been symbolically subdued, Jewish resistance persisted until the ultimate Roman conquest of Masada in 73 AD. This event signified the end of the First Jewish Revolt, yet it was merely the precursor to several subsequent uprisings, each resulting in escalating devastation. The Siege of Jerusalem is particularly notable as one of the most brutal instances of total warfare in the classical era, comparable to the fall of Carthage 2 centuries prior.